Incorporations. We're very happy to be hosting Professor Matthew Hull, who's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, where he works in both the sociocultural and linguistic subfields. Professor Hull has conducted fieldwork in both Pakistan and in India, where his research focuses on the nexus of representation, technology, and institutions. He's the author of Government of Paper, The Materiality of Bureaucracy in Urban Pakistan, which charts a groundbreaking path in the analysis of documents as semiotic technologies that mediate the workings of city government and the mapping and zoning of real estate in Islamabad. Professor Hull has also written on democratic technologies of speech in post-colonial India and on the history and theory of the modern corporation, which he will discuss with us today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Matthew Hull.
Thank you very much, Marshall. And thank you all for coming. Is this microphone? Is it working? No, just great acoustics here. Sounds like I do have a microphone on. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Penn Anthropology Department, and thanks especially to Marshall for organizing everything. So I've been teaching about corporations for about a decade now. It started really as an undergraduate course that I for a first-year seminar, and I dragged the topic within screaming distance of my expertise, which is really on corporate bureaucracy. And of course, so one of my interests in corporations comes from studying the East India Company, which of course began as, which was the precursor to the modern Pakistan bureaucracy. So I found that I had to really try to get my mind around what a corporation was to understand later development of this transition into something we now think of as corporations. The other thing was the other source of my interest in corporations was dissatisfactions with modern political theory, which is really focused on the relationship between individuals and the state, leaving these huge political entities, whales swimming through the ocean, really largely undetected and unthought. So my interest in corporations then has a very much a sort of a kind of political theory, institutional look to it. So I've been teaching about them for a while, but I haven't yet, or I've just started writing about them and trying to come up with coherent thoughts. So you're really getting something quite raw. So I really would be interested to hear what you think about it and what you think is productive and what's not. So on this talk, I'm going to try to sketch a problem area rather than give a kind of definitive answers to many of the questions that I'm raising. So one last qualification is that I'm talking about corporations, and I won't keep saying American corporations or Anglo-American corporations, but I'm going to speak in a very American accent here when I'm thinking about corporations. And that partly to do with, especially when I start talking about contemporary relationships between corporations and governments. So apologies to anyone who is at the AAA panel. This is a very similar talk, but longer in detail, so I hope I had enough new analysis and material to keep it of interest. But Greg and I were on a terrific panel at AAA last year, and I gave a very similar kind of paper. So let me talk first about a couple of reasons that corporations haven't received as much attention to within anthropology as they should. Actually, for this crowd, I probably don't need to give this, but in fact, I'll probably skip. So one of the obvious reasons is that formal organizations more generally have not been the focus of anthropological study for obvious reasons, the historical focus of the discipline in small-scale societies and so forth. More interesting, perhaps, is the way that I think even now the corporation is ubiquitous, but we haven't really found a theoretical place for it yet. And this has to do with the framing of our contemporary order in terms of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism focuses on the subject formation, particularly individuals, and it takes on the idea that individuals have to become more entrepreneurial. So it's still focused on that, and then it really it's also focused on states pulling back, ideas of marketization. So it's focused on market formation, more and more things being pushed into the market. So even when you find some work like Ilana Shriver's terrific work on Argentine oil industry, when people are working on corporations, they tend to try to find these themes within them. So you find her work is terrific work showing how people who are even within corporations have to be entrepreneurial in new ways. So it's focused on outsourcing. So again, the focus is subject formation, about individuals and how these are formed within corporations. And you see it also with Jean and John Conrad's terrific work on ethnicity in South Africa, where they talk about their book course called Ethnicity Inc., which is describing how different kinds of groups are involved in commodifying cultural practices. But the Inc. there stands really for business rather than corporations as such. They touch on the issue, but it's really about a process of commodification. And they're not so much interested in the institutional dynamics. It's the fact that corporations, as opposed to other kinds of entities, own these property rights. So there's a real way in which neoliberalism and the focus on markets has really occluded our view of corporations. So they're found empirically in accounts. Like you can look at David Harvey's work on neoliberalism defining it. Corporations are all through it, but they're not seen really as central players. Or rather, they're seen as market players rather than major institutions that are forming markets and deciding what things come into them and how markets will operate. I have actually a very old view of corporations coming from the East India Company, where they were clearly market makers. And this is a perspective that you also can find. Thurston Veblen would be a pioneer of this perspective of corporations not as players within existing markets, but organizations that fundamentally are able to, in either singly or in concert, shape how markets work. And if we think about free trade, for example, we think of this in neoliberalism, and conceptualize this as expansion of markets. But if you really look at what's happening in world trade, it's more the rollback of state regulation of trade, but the massive increase of corporate regulation of trade. And so I just brought some stats for you. So you see that the WTO, of course, regulates states, not corporations. So the restrictions are always placed on states, restrictions against restricting trade. So trade is freed from states, so it can be more highly regulated by corporations. So according to an OECD report in 2007, 60% of international trade takes place between subsidiaries within transnational groups. And that's subsidiaries, that is when there's a formal ownership relation. But if you look at companies that are slaves to other companies in various ways, it's even higher. So all this trade is being massively organized by corporations, conducting business with their own subsidiaries, or else other corporations that are tightly integrated into supply chains or financial arrangements so that they can't really be seen as independent entities at all. We might say, alongside our notion of formally free labor, we need to develop a notion of the formally free corporation. Though, of course, they don't deserve the same sympathy. So these are corporations that are formally free but are slaved to work in different ways with companies who are their major buyer of some kind. So the percentage of trade that can be seen as effectively intra-firm has skyrocketed under the so-called free trade policies of WTO. We would actually be better to return to an 18th century English notion of free trade. And of course, in the 18th century, free trade was all about opening up the monopoly of the East India Company. And it wasn't about liberating trade from the regulation of the state. So it was all about keeping the East India Company from regulating. And we could have, actually, if you think of a free trade movement, which would be aimed at corporate monopolies, and that would be a very interesting kind of development. So that's, I think, a major way where the reason that, well, we have a couple people in here, of course, doing terrific work. So, but anthropology really hasn't. There's tons of work on states and the politics of states, but we're really just coming to terms with how to think about corporations as political entities. So it's a big problem in anthropology that we so often focus on the effects or the marginal forms or aspects of important institutions, rather than directly tackling their most central form and features. But today, I'm mostly going to ignore this concern and focus on the admittedly marginal form of the corporation, what I'll call, with some reservations, the community corporation. They don't mean anything especially warm and fuzzy by this term. So let me start with some examples to show you what I mean by the term community corporation. Since the mid-1930s, and especially since the mid-1970s, most Native American tribes have formed for-profit corporations with tribal members as shareholders who elect corporate boards independent of tribal government. In the last few decades, American churches have reorganized themselves under various state non-profit corporation laws. The chief of the Bafokeng Nation in South Africa rules partly through the influence over Royal Bafokeng Holdings, a large development corporation that manages mineral rights and a large investment portfolio. Officers and former officers of the Pakistan Army now run the two largest conglomerates in Pakistan, with corporate subsidiaries that do everything from manufacture cement to bake bread and print wedding invitations. A farming community called a clan in most reports on the periphery of Pune, India, pooled their land in a private limited corporation and developed a city with housing for 50,000 people and workspace for 40,000. I'll have more to say about that one. In Papua New Guinea, dissent groups are forming incorporated land groups in the hopes of being recognized by the state and multinational corporations as potential partners for resource extraction deals. So I'm not going to try to defend the kind of rigorous idea of definition of community corporation. I'm using the term to highlight how these corporations are different from what we might call standard issue corporations. Standard issue corporations are the sort we're most familiar with, traded on a large stock exchange in London or New York, with hundreds of thousands or millions even of individual and institutional shareholders connected mostly or only through their ownership of shares. Community corporations, by contrast, share many of the features of standard issue corporations. You have ownership by shares, boards chosen by shareholders, etc. The difference is that shareholders are drawn primarily from a group of some sort that pre-exists the establishment of the corporation. They're genuinely corporate institutions, but they're still entangled with the various kinds of social relations beyond the corporations. If we thought of them in Polanyi's terms, we might say they're embedded in, or perhaps not disembedded from, collective relations that precede and remain outside them. So let me make a couple immediate qualifications to this characterization. First, membership of every business corporation emerges from sociality at some scale. Two friends in a garage or dorm room, Apple and Google in this case, and families, of course. These are all sources of corporations in the first place. But their many shareholders are brought into relation through institutional connections and infrastructure. Their connections don't depend that much on ties that pre-exist their participation in the corporation. Second, such corporations are not so much a new phenomenon, but the return of an old one. In their origins, most corporations through roughly the middle of the 19th century could be called community corporations in this sense. One can think of the London traders who formed both the East India Company and the London Company. They were, Barney Cohen sort of puckishly called them a caste. They were massively intermarried, very tightly located in one area of London. And this formed the basis of membership in the company in the early 1600s, both companies, the one that formed Virginia and East India Company. So I'm going to talk about community corporations both in the present, what we might think of as the prehistory of the modern joint stock company, the regulated companies of 1600s. So in the unfairly maligned tradition of armchair anthropology, I'm going to draw shamelessly on the empirical, ethnographic, and historical work of other people to come up with some general insights about this. The last qualification is that I'm mainly talking about the kind of political legal form of the company, the corporation. Not so much corporations, or what corporations do, what kind of work they do within it, the relations among employees, and many other important aspects of corporations. So I'm mainly interested in the place of corporations within our modern, especially American institutional order. So my focus is really different here from Greg and Jessup's work, which is more about looking at the functioning, although they also, of course, are interested in the larger institutional position as well. So one distinction to make, too, is the difference between a firm and a corporation. So firms are large organizations, they're managerial structures, and so forth. But that doesn't have is only contingently connected with the legal form of the corporation. Corporation form is enjoyed by many nonprofit entities. So the first ones are universities, monasteries, municipalities, associations of that kind, which were granted long before they were granted corporate status long before business entities were allowed to have corporate status. So when I think of what am I tracing here? What's my historical object that's tracking along from 1600s to the present? Basically, an organization with three basic rights granted by some superior body, be it the church or a state. First is the right to own property, make contracts, sue and be sued as a unitary legal entity, so sometimes called a legal person. The second is the right to centralize management of this property. And the third is the right to establish and enforce rules within its jurisdiction and beyond those of the law of the land, such as you can think about the Benedictines with their own internal rules, town ordinances, bylaws, and work rules are all part of a continuum. If you look back at the East India Company early documents, the equivalent of what we would see as a kind of office guide was actually called the rules and laws of the East India Company. So there's a real interplay between work rules and law in this history. So in this talk, I'm going to analyze the corporations in terms of two classic anthropological problems. For convenience, we might call these the Mauss problem and the Mauss problem. I'll devote most of this talk to the Mauss problem and then move on to the Mauss problem in conclusion. So what is the Mauss problem? Sorry, the Mauss one. So Claude Mauss, of course, famously pioneered the exploration of how capitalism expands by not by eliminating, but by using pre-existing forms of sociality, such as how mining operations in Africa were able to keep wages for miners below that required to sustain them. So this is a critique of Marx. Because they depended on the subsistence economies in the villages that the miners were still drawing sustenance from. So Mauss's work suggests a parallel series of questions regarding corporations. How do corporations emerge from and draw on other forms of sociality? What forms of sociality promote them and in what conditions? How do these forms of sociality shape the corporations that emerge? For example, how does a corporation look different if it's created by the officer corps of the Pakistan Army or a farming clan in India? And something that's particularly interesting for anthropologists, I think, how do such corporations reshape the sociality at their base? So what is different about descent groups that project part of their collective relationships into collective corporate form? So the key issue in all these questions is how different kinds of sociality relate to each other. How do corporations translate other forms of sociality, and as a consequence, differently integrate individuals and groups into state and capitalist processes? So I use translation here in a kind of Latourian way. It's partly to avoid the kind of undue precision that can come to supply a more precise word. But the basic sort of sense of translation for Latour is that some aspect of one thing is carried into a new form, but as a consequence, both entities are reshaped in the process. It's the kind of idea of mutual determination. So when groups start corporations or align themselves with corporations, what exactly happens in that process? This question lies squarely in the anthropological tradition of two sets of questions that sometimes remain poorly articulated. First, how are people, goods, etc., drawn into capitalist relations? And second, how do communities or groups become recognized or otherwise related to states? Incorporation importantly combines both these processes. So first, capitalism. I suggest that we place incorporation alongside commoditization as a concept to understand the expansion of capitalism as a major mode in which capitalist relations plunge into other forms of social life and partly reorganize them. Incorporation is a fundamentally different way that people can relate to capitalist processes that is quite different from the ways that Marxism and other political economic approaches have portrayed the expansion of capitalism. Though certainly incorporation is not, for now, as significant and broad in scope as marketization, but we might see its importance rapidly growing. Community corporations can show us how collective life is drawn into capitalist arrangements, not through the expansion of market of goods and labor, but through this legal process of incorporation. So treatments of the expansion of capitalism, whether inspired by Adam Smith or Marx, have overwhelmingly focused on the incorporation of new kinds of objects, services, labor, and rights into a realm of general exchange, call it marketization or commoditization. And consideration of subject making within this process has been focused on two kinds: the formation of a kind of bourgeois subject, an acquisitive individual, and secondly, how workers are made through time management and other kinds of practices. So work on these forms of subject formation is, of course, immensely valuable, but it has mainly concerned itself with new forms of production by managerial firms without enough attention to legal form and governance practices specific to shareholder capitalism or shareholder corporations. Scholarly traditions on capitalism have usually seen it as a force that erodes most pre-existing communal relations. And there are good reasons for this. We have the enclosures, various kinds of private property itself, part of this enclosure story, demise of guilds. There are a lot of reasons for thinking that capitalism is something that erodes common ties of different kinds. But these kinds of analysis tend to ignore the sort of collective dimensions of capitalism or property, consigning it to the past or residues in the present. For example, communal villages, land held by indigenous groups, and so forth. So residues rather than things that are actually generated through capitalist processes. What I would like to do is to argue that corporate property is becoming a more and more vibrant form within capitalism. It has been for a long time, of course, and will continue to be so, and we need to think about incorporation as key to this. So the task is to understand collective subjects within capitalism, with all the sort of caution we have, of course, about reification of agents of this kind. We have to come to terms with these large-scale actors in some fashion. Okay, so that's for capitalism. What about the state? The problem of how states, especially liberal states, can recognize and relate to groups is, of course, well known. How various state knowledge instruments and institutions of rule identify groups and their representations has been a major topic within post-colonial studies and a lot of other domains. Take South Asia, we can think here of how things like the colonial census, which solidified membership in various kinds of so-called communities, or castes, and so forth, and through this process, leaders are recruited, so groups are made. So corporate forms draw on these state-shaped forms of identification, as well as some forms that states have never especially altered. But corporations offer new ways for groups to unify and to be collectively recognized by states, especially in the matter of common property and the transactions such common property enables. Of course, they also allow groups to relate to other corporations in new ways. So there's a kind of doubling that often happens with these corporations. So I'm going to talk about 5 broad themes on the Mauss problem. How these things relate. So let me start with how it is that corporation transforms relationships of groups with states and other corporations. So corporations are a very interesting entity. They're beyond the individual, but not quite government. They're a social vehicle through which people can collectively relate to the state and to other corporations in new ways. We see this perhaps most dramatically in the Papua New Guinea dissent groups that Joshua Bell has documented. These very small dissent groups, sometimes numbering barely 100 members, are hoping to get oil contracts and other kinds of mining things by forming what the Papua New Guinea state recognized as so-called incorporated land groups. Such corporations are not automatically awarded property rights, but they're at least recognized as something that can be an interlocutor with the government in disputes over language or rather disputes or claiming land. And their members imagine that they can contract with corporations, large international corporations, though in practice they're of course much too small. State law forces the communities who profit from such contracts to, as Joshua Bell puts it, to take a specific form in order to be seen. So in order to be a group and to be seen, they have to form corporation, a process that Bell nicely terms entification. So they're entifying their collective relations. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. This is a similar story to what modern states have been doing for a long time. They've been mapping people, gathering them into groups, communities, castes, ethnicities, and so forth, trying to select representatives. In some ways, incorporation is just a new phase of that. It's a process that is at once analogous and often built upon state forms of collective recognition that has already reformatted collective governance and individual identifications. This is very clear, for example, in the new ways the U.S. government in the mid-1930s simultaneously recognized many new populations of Native Americans as tribes and encouraged them at the same point to found for-profit and also non-profit corporations. So there's often this kind of doubling where corporations are often parasitic on earlier different forms of state identification. Jessica Catalino writes about this process with respect to the Seminoles. Seminole corporations allow the tribe to do business with corporations that would be reluctant, that is, say, other business corporations that would be reluctant to deal with a sovereign entity like the Seminole tribe, with its complex politics and unbusinesslike interests and ways of operating, and also the fears of how do you collect on a sovereign tribe. It's more complicated than you might think. The corporate form also eliminates jurisdictional questions that surround dealings with the tribes. So instead of a corporation trying to deal with a sovereign entity, they incorporate into the laws of Delaware usually, and then you're dealing with Delaware corporation law, and it's all very clear. One can tell similar stories about native and tribal corporations really all over the US. So another striking example is an agricultural village group in India that I'll have some more to say today. They're Muggars. This is sometimes called a clan or a caste in popular English language accounts. Both of these terms, of course, coming from venerable colonial sociology from the region. This is outside of Pune. This is a farming community that had been in the area, they claim, for around 300 years. I haven't actually had a chance to do field work with them yet, so this is all based on their own documentation that I've gotten. They had a governance system through panchayat, through what was called a panchayat mechanism. This is a kind of village council where people do vote, but it tends to be highly consensus-oriented. As the city was expanding, the cities their land was in danger of being notified. We're talking about notification of land. So, acquired by the city government for the expansion. And so, annexed and their community would be gone. People also started to sell out individual properties. So, the community realized it was headed for dissolution. And so, they decided to form a for-profit corporation. So, they pooled their land and formed into a corporation, and then developed the land collectively themselves. So, individuals were given shares corresponding to the amount of land they contributed, which is very important. And now the city has housing for about 50,000 residents, and another 40,000 people work there. So it's a kind of happy story of these people that got rich developing land outside of Pune, and they also took residential apartments within the community. So before this, forming the corporation, there was really no way for this community to deal with developers and deal with the state. But once they formed a corporation, they were able to deal very effectively and on very different terms with both. So that's one of the interesting things to see with corporations, how groups, how they articulate collectively with the state and other corporations and not simply as individuals. So in some ways you could look at corporations as a kind of solution to the problem of the liberal state, which sounds in a positive way actually. All right, next theme, membership. So another thing that comes up quite a bit when you form a corporation is the whole question of who's in it. What are the memberships, both within the community and within the corporations? So when communities form corporations, you get a lot of disputes over who's in and who's out. There's a tightening of group affiliation that comes with incorporation. The Commonwealths have summarized this very dynamic very nicely. They say, the more ethnically, I'm quoting here, the more ethnically defined populations move toward the model of incorporation, the more their terms of membership tend to become matters of concern, regulation, and contestation, unquote. So this is partly, of course, due to the benefits that are coming or at stake when you are part of a group that suddenly has resources. And this, obviously, this dynamic should be really put in the same category of looking at how citizenship in states is regulated, partly out of concern for the kind of welfare benefits that are given to people who become citizens. But there's also a difference in the way corporations as institutions relate to individuals, so something beyond just the material stakes that go up. When it comes to membership, corporations are among the most inflexible of groups. Membership in corporation is much less flexible than it is for most kinds of communities, whether you're thinking religious or ethno-national or professional, in which membership is usually differentially or ambiguously recognized by other members. Corporations are much more rigid than states in the way they deal with group membership. That is, when you're thinking at least below the level of the nation as a whole. States tend to deal with groups through categorizations that often leave membership in a group fuzzy, despite the criticisms they've gotten for forming rigid groups within post-colonial theory. The identification of corporate members or shareholders is much less flexible because it's a matter of connection to specific individual property and political rights. It requires the documentation of all the actual individuals rather than categories of people. So there are huge problems in trying to take a kind of diffuse ethnic or these different kinds of groups that are defined through social process of recognition and to actually map them in terms of definite individuals. So community membership is aligned with but defined by a different set of processes that define determination of shareholders. For example, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 settled large amounts of Alaska land with tribes via newly formed for-profit corporations in which only Native Americans born before 1971 would be shareholders. One of the goals of this legislation was to put an end to the disputes over land ownership that arose precisely because tribal membership was so open to dispute, because it depended on changing and contested practices of recognition. So with corporate ways are also, corporations provide the mechanisms for states to definitely nail down who's a member of a group and who isn't, at least for property. To return to the PNG example, the group that Josh Bell is writing about had 12 dissent groups in 1995, and each formed their own corporation. But then they had interlocked arguments about dissent group membership and corporate shareholding. And by 2007 had divided themselves into 47 dissent groups, each with its own corresponding corporation, or incorporated land group. So membership in corporation is extremely consequential, not only for the related group, for the activities of the corporation. Take, for example, the contrast, so rather, the membership structures are really consequential. If you can see in the contrast, to take a very old example, of the membership structures of the East India Company and the London Company, both formed around 1600 and 1603. And London Company was the one that ended up in Virginia. So neither of these was a joint stock company, so that's why I'm talking about it in terms of membership, not shareholders. But it had all the basic features of modern corporations, except for that. So the different membership policies, that is, rules for who could join the company and how, had a huge impact on the formation of imperialism in India and settler democracy in Virginia, including its pattern of political exclusions. So it's really be too reductive. I'm not saying you follow the corporate organization and you'll see what happened in India versus Virginia, but the development of an imperial colonial government in India, which excluded Indians from participation, can be traced to membership policies of the East India Company that excluded Indians. So there are many ways to become a member of the East India Company, but none of these avenues were available to Indians, who were systematically then seen to be outside the interests of the government in that sense. So the political exclusion later that turned up as the enemy of the nationalist movement was really prefigured in the fact that they were not allowed to join the corporation in the first place. In contrast, you could argue that the unusually open membership policy of the London Company, which settled Virginia and was now the United States, was central to its undoing as a corporation and its development into a republican polity. Anyone who went to the colony and his descendants, anyone who went to the colony to work, was given membership in the company. And of course, the parallel to Indians here is Native Americans, who were very much excluded. So this policy blended rigid corporate membership practices to the more ambiguous open processes by which settlements grow. So through the charter of the London Company, though the charter was revoked in 1624, by then a system of settlement-based representative corporate governance was already in place. Each settlement sent what was called a burgess to represent its interest in the company. So the original House of Burgesses was entirely an entirely corporate representative governance body. It had nothing to do with political power, paramount political power as such. Okay, so next, what does this do to the relationships when corporations? So the third topic, what does it do to the relationships among members? One of the reasons the Mugger-Putta group decided to use a corporate model rather than a cooperative model was to solve this problem of how relationships would work out. So they could have formed a cooperative model which would allow them to manage the lands in common, and of course cooperatives exploded in India both in the late colonial period but also in the independence period. So it's a very recognizable form. But the Mugger-Putta villagers were very explicit about how the cooperative model was all about equality, and therefore it was unworkable in their current situation, which is that they have very unequal land relationships. There were large landowners and small landowners, and politically the large landowners dominate the small ones. The corporate model offered a solution to this, how they could join together and still maintain their relationships of relative dominance and asymmetrical relationships, despite the widespread commitment to egalitarian values in India. So it's quite open that this was the point. So a leading figure of this movement, and I'm just going to give you this quote, we chose to set up a private limited company, knowing well that the initiative involved so many people and therefore strong leadership was required. We knew it would be difficult, even a bit unrealistic, to expect people owning various sizes of land to be treated unequally, especially in commercial activity. It would rob families of the incentive for pooling their lands in the first place. So he's saying that a cooperative model could never have done this because they needed to preserve their unequal relationships in a common form. So this is what the corporation offered them. So unequal relations in the corporate form are rendered legitimate, where democratic ethos would, to some extent, and here I'm speculating, have called into question the exercise of authority based on economic power. So inequality is legitimate within the corporate form. Of course, this is not always the case. This feature of contemporary corporation developed over nearly 2 centuries as the one-person, one-vote structure of early 17th century regulated companies gradually gave way to joint stock company structures, granting a vote to some number of shares. So when first everyone was a member of the company, didn't initially matter how much stock you had in the company, you only got 1 vote, no matter how much stock. And then gradually they made it for every 500 shares you got 1 vote. And then finally it moved gradually to 1 share, 1 vote. So this was a slow, gradual conversion of political rights into economic rights into political rights. And nowadays we find a kind of extreme version, almost inversion, of the old East India Company membership model, where with preferred stock you can sometimes get 10 votes per single share. So Google founders, for example, the stock they own is preferred stock, which has 10 votes per share. This will go away when they die. But you see, that's a magnification of the economic rights, even into the kind of completely overwhelming the political ones. So the other way this relationships transform when in corporations are really the tangling up of all these corporate management practices where you're supposed to hire people based on qualifications and so forth. And yet many of these groups are based on ethics of mutual service and hiring relatives and taking care of people. So there's a real conflict between these. Thomas Thornton writes about how in the Tunget's large landholding corporation, assisting matrilineal relatives has become recast as nepotism. So there's a lot of question about as a community what you're supposed to do, and then when these community corporations are formed, an entirely different kind of ethics directly comes into conflict. Now we move on to governance, and I think this will be the last major theme here. This is a very interesting dimension. So what sorts of hitches are there to corporations? Corporations rule vary quite a bit, and there are many different kinds, but they all basically have a single structure, at least in the Anglo-American world. They all have directors and a board in some fashion, and this is consistent from 1600 into the present within the Anglo-American world. These arrangements are often in conflict with other ways of organizing and conceptualizing government. So you have this contradiction that corporate form really doesn't fit. The corporate form really being a largely Republican Protestant outcome of the 1600s that just doesn't fit other ways of organizing life. So, among Native American corporations, clan and house group ties play a big role in who leads these organizations. There's been some terrific writing on Bafokeng, where you see that the Bafokeng, the chief or king, leads partly through his hereditary title that will pass down to his son. It's been 5 generations. And he also, in another domain, leads through being the person who gets to appoint the board, or has the most influence in appointing the board of Bafokeng Holding Corporation, which is a huge corporation that distributes mining concessions and actually operates mining operations. So you see these two different modes of governance that are very uncomfortably connected with each other. It's sort of kingly authority, and then the CEO that's nominally supposed to be elected by the shareholders in the company. You see a similar kind of conflict among the Seminoles as well that Justin Catalino writes about. One of the most interesting examples of this is the kind of conflict between modes of governance is actually happening within American churches. So some forms of churches, like congregational churches, can be governed quite harmoniously or according to corporate norms, since they share a common history in Protestant, Republican thinking and practice. The largest mainline Protestant denomination, the Methodist Church, was actually tangled up with Republican thinking from its beginnings in the mid-18th century, and it has a governance structure that really resembles that of the U.S. government. But this government model doesn't fit very well with Episcopal forms like the Catholic Church and the U.S. Episcopal Church, where the whole basic theological justification of authority is based on the doctrine of apostolic succession, a line of bishops. So mainline Protestants, of course, reject this apostolic succession. So boards are fundamentally about checks and balances and distrust of fallible humans, the kinds of things which are anathema to how apostolic church is organizing its ecclesiastical hierarchy. So in the U.S., the Reformation is renewed through prosecution of nonprofit corporation law. So there's a kind of Protestant bias to U.S. law that's attacking apostolic succession as a way of conceptualizing religious authority and control. One of the most intriguing tie-ups between corporations and American religious organizations is the Mormon Church, Church of Latter-day Saints. So that most American of religions has a history entwined with the rise of most American institutions, the large, unaccountable business corporation. So here we have a more dynamic history of conflict and eventual convergence between church and corporate forms. What is now known as the LDS Church was incorporated in 1851 by legislation of the state of Deseret, a provisional state proposed by Mormons that was dissolved 2 years later it wasn't recognized by the U.S. government. In 1887, the Corporation of the Mormon was legally dissolved by the Act of the United States Congress because the church's practice of polygamy. The LDS Church saw its vulnerability to the state via its incorporation, and after that never incorporated again in a single entity that would be so easily dealt with. They did incorporate in various kinds of entities that are interlocked, and it's very difficult to figure out to really disentangle the legal corporate structure of the LDS Church from the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It's just a complete tangle up. So actually, I won't go into some of the details, which are very interesting. But the church. But what's interesting about the churches is where other churches have often find conflicts, aside from the mainline denominations, between forms of ecclesiastical authority and corporate governance and activities. The Mormon Church has successfully fused them. Ecclesiastical authority and corporate governance reinforce each other. It's even really impossible to pull them apart. So that most of the church property and church policy is dominated by this one corporation, which is the corporation of the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and 2 bishops who act as the corporate board. And then all the property is linked in different ways to them. Okay, so these are the ways in which I think that the kind of Maussian problems, how incorporation happens, how is the new corporation different through its connection with the old corporation, and simultaneously how are different aspects of the underlying group life and relationships altered. So let me move on to the Mauss problem. So aside from the question of how these corporations relate to their associated forms of sociality, there's another kind of question, for which a convenient term would be the Mauss question. What can these gifts tell us about commodities? What insights can studying these sorts of community corporations give us into standard issue corporations, especially those based in and emerging from Europe and North America? So what dimensions of standard issue corporations might be thrown into relief? My initial interest in these so-called community corporations was sparked in typically anthropological fashion by the peculiarity of all these groups forming corporations And what an odd thing it was that you'd have corporations that are so tightly bound up with some particular kind of sociality, and of such varied sorts. But we can also turn this question around and ask what form of sociality is associated with modern standard issue corporations. We might answer this question by saying it's a sociality formed by brokers, boards, investment banks, computers trading shares, mutual funds, pension funds, and all those sorts of things. I'm not sure if everyone would count that as a form of sociality, but it would definitely chart what connects everyone who is a shareholder in a particular company. This may or may not be satisfying as a social science explanation, but is actually a fundamental political problem for large publicly held corporations themselves. There's a contradiction between the Republican political model of a corporation and the actual contemporary organizational structure of corporations. In the early 17th century, the English East Company and London Company, operating in different spheres, were pioneers in liberal theory and Republican political arrangements. As Blackstone once observed, corporations are republics writ small. This should not surprise us, as corporations and constitutional republics share a common history. In 1600, the English East India Company was organized as a self-governing republic established by a written constitution. In fact, the corporation, of course, pioneered the whole idea of a constitution, which provided for the annual election of a governor and board of directors by the members of the company in raucous annual meetings. They could also mint money, give corporal punishment to employees, among many other things. The charter of the London Company evolved into the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia with striking few changes. There's much work to be done in placing the liberal Republican tradition within the history of corporations rather than only states. So I would say less Locke, more letters patent. But the point I want to make here is that the number and connections among members and later shareholders and the governance structure of corporations through at least the mid-19th century in the Anglo-American world enabled them to maintain Republican political arrangements, even as the early one vote gave way to vote based on share ownership. The massive growth of corporations and their aggregation and holding companies at the end of the 19th century produced a recognition of the breakdown of the Republican model expressed in a property idiom in the landmark 1937 study of Burley and Means as, quote, the separation of ownership and control. In the second half of the 20th century, the rise of pension and mutual funds that hold stock for investors who have no knowledge of their holdings drove individuals further from participation in corporate governance, a fact righteously condemned in Gordon Gekko's famous speech in 1984, Wall Street, for any of you who've seen that movie. But the dissolution of the people is not only a matter of new forms of financial holdings. American corporate managers design corporate governance arrangements to ensure individual shareholders have almost no voice. Lists of shareholders are made available only in hard to consult paper form. Email addresses are not maintained in an effort to make communication with shareholders difficult and expensive. The proxy ballots with which individual shareholders vote for board members would make the Soviet Politburo blush, with one candidate for each position. On the ballot itself, it's usually written that the board supports these candidates, as well they might, since most of them are actually included on the ballot. Shareholder proposals gain a place on the ballots, usually after some kinds of legal tussling involving SEC reviews. And again, written statements on the ballots themselves reject them. So the ballot says the board of directors of this company does not recommends you vote against proposals 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 shareholder proposals. So there's a sort of pitiful ineffectiveness of contemporary shareholder activism is really testimony to the success of these very effective ways of marginalizing individual participation. Although institutional shareholders, of course, have much more role of this kind. The Indian clan or Pakistan officer corps is not a people in the way Republican theory construes this. However, like even large associations such as political organizations, religious, or advocacy groups, they can be seen as having been founded for a purpose and are therefore be expressively or ideologically unified, even absent mechanisms for aggregating wills, which is the classic democratic problem. By contrast, from such a dispersed, isolated population of mutually unknowing shareholder citizens of the large Anglo-American corporation, there is no way to constitute people, no way to fabricate a will. Corporations are republics without a people. The so-called shareholder value movement that began in the 1980s was an attempt to substitute for a collective will the fiction of shareholders united in their devotion to abstract economic gain, with no interest in whether they can breathe clean air, have a good job, educate their children, etc. It's precisely through the invocation of such fictional individual shareholders that the actual interests of shareholders can be ignored, if not actively suppressed. So this problem might seem rather abstract and happily ignored, a kind of political theory, historical interest, and it might even be celebrated by corporate managers who've used every legal device to exacerbate that in the interest of their own control. However, this problem has led to a controversy over the basic political and legal position of corporations within the U.S. So this is evident in the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Citizens United that gave corporations the right to spend unlimited amounts of money in support of electoral candidates. So let me just talk a little bit about this as a way of concluding. So the court rather speculatively asked in Citizens United, can the corporation speak? The decision, like most Supreme Courts, was issued, of course, in a series of opinions, including ones that received majority and minority support, and I'm just going to talk about it in simple terms, minority and minority opinions. The minority argued that no one was speaking when a corporation speaks. That is, words are attributed to the corporation, but there's no human who willfully supports them. So I'm just going to quote from this Supreme Court decision, which, since we're here in Penn, I hear the echoes of Goffman in this analysis by the minority. It's an interesting question, so I'm quoting here, an interesting question, who is even speaking when a business corporation places an advertisement that endorses or attacks a particular candidate? Presumably, it's not the customers or employees who typically have no such say in matters. It cannot realistically be said to be the shareholders, who tend to be far removed from the day-to-day decisions of the firm and whose political preferences may be opaque to management. Perhaps the officers or directors of the corporation have the best claim to be the ones speaking, except their fiduciary duties generally prohibit them from using corporate funds for personal ends. Some individuals associated with the corporation must make the decision to place the ad, but the idea that these individuals are thereby fostering their self-expression or cultivating their critical faculties is fanciful. It is entirely possible that the corporation's electoral message will conflict with their personal convictions. So that's the minority opinion. So according to the minority opinion, no one can be seen to have willfully taken up the position to which the meaning of the utterances attests. So in Goffman's terms, there's no principle. The ability to produce so much speech no one willfully commits to parallels the infamous capacity of corporations to act without anyone in corporations being responsible. The majority did not dispute this characterization, but argued it was actually irrelevant. It argued that the U.S. Constitution protects not speakers, but speech, disconnected from acts of speaking and from commitment to the content of the utterance. Thus, we have protection of utterances with no intention linked to it. So a whole different way of thinking about speech as artifact. Surely it is produced by humans, but is more like a cup of Starbucks coffee in relation to the server. Whatever meanings it has are not really referable to the server. And here I'm tempted by an even more direct connection with Mauss, a parallel between gifts and commodities, and speech as respectively characterized by minority and majority. The gift, as alienated thing that nevertheless is connected to the giver, is analogous to the 18th century idea of speech as the external expression of an individual's will. The commodity as something completely separated from its producers, defined by its value independent of its relationship to the giver. This compares to speech as inanimate, artifactual, whose meaning is not to be found with reference to the will of its speaker. So linguistic anthropologists wouldn't really like either way of thinking about language as the minority or majority articulate. But both opinions grapple with the difficulty of construing the corporation as a political subject conceptualized in terms of collective will produced through practices of representing individual wills. The minority disqualifies the interpretable artifacts produced by corporations as political speech by highlighting their disconnection from any committed will. The majority qualifies the interpretable artifacts produced by corporations as political speech by rejecting the necessity of any link to any will. So I'll just end there. So we can see then that the crisis of Republican political model of corporation is really at the heart of a lot of very contemporary debates about the role of corporations within a modern political order, particularly in electoral processes. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.